Whether it's good or bad, it's all temporary. So either enjoy it or bear it just a bit longer. Either be present with it or trust that it will pass because it always does. We can't let the intensity of certain emotions blind us to the bigger picture and allow us to see everything now in a negative light just because what we're experiencing right now is a negative emotion. Just because the emotional state currently is negative doesn't mean that everything around us is also going to be painted in that negative light or needs to be painted in that negative light. More than anything else, it's about detaching. Because when we're experiencing good things, you know, we don't really need this advice. If anything, maybe if we're having thoughts that are taking us out of the present moment, we can cultivate some sort of mindfulness where we're not allowing a thought to carry us out and have us thinking about something other than the enjoyable present moment. But more so, in extremely difficult times, in times of extreme discomfort, we can repeat the affirmation, it will pass. And we can say that as many times as we need to. It will pass. It will pass. And it's not about escaping the present moment, but rather it's detaching from the experience as it being something other than temporary. Because everything is temporary. No matter how long it may last, it's temporary. Everything is. Any experience, any emotion, any loops of thought, any amount of discomfort, it's all temporary. And as much as we want to believe that all of the unbearable discomfort that we've experienced in our lives is behind us, that would be quite negligent, I think, and a little bit ignorant, because we can acknowledge that there is discomfort that may lie ahead for us in the future. But even in that scenario, even in that case, they are going to be short-lived in comparison to the rest of our life. So the aim isn't to live our lives in a way where we're constantly avoiding discomfort, but rather live in a way where we can detach from anything being permanent or from anything permanently tainting our perspective in a certain way. When you're experiencing intense emotions, when you're experiencing extreme discomfort, that isn't the time to make logical decisions about your life. That isn't the time to trust your perspective. You trust your perspective after the experience has already passed and you're back to a more neutral state of mind. That's what people do. They forget that the temporary nature of what they're experiencing will eventually pass, and they will eventually come back to that baseline that they can trust and count on, from which they can make decisions. And here's an interesting thought experiment. Notice your perspective on life, notice your opinions, notice your belief systems when you're embedded with this amount of discomfort, when you're surrounded by, I guess, that negativity. Notice the things that you naturally cling to in your mind. And notice how that's different from when things are going right or even when things are going even remotely solid. We have a more foundational idea of what we want out of life, what we want out of relationships, what we want for our path. And then once we're in the midst of a really strong storm, immense difficulty, we tend to forget about all that. We tend to forget that, there will come a time when this feeling is no longer present. And it's in acknowledging that we can trust in our future self, our future baselined self, who is already at the end of this discomfort. So now our job, when we're experiencing discomfort, is to do nothing else but bear it. And I know that sounds maybe a little bit dark, just bear it a bit longer. But what else can we do in that situation? A positive mindset doesn't fix a stomach ache. It just takes some time and it passes. A positive mindset isn't necessarily going to fix the wound of a breakup, a heartbreak. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some healing. So it's not our responsibility as this current version of ourselves that is experiencing that immense discomfort to make any sort of logical decisions, to be the one, to be the guide and the leader. That's the version of us that is back at baseline. And we can trust that version of us to make decisions that is for the benefit of all versions of ourselves. So you notice how I'm creating a sort of timeline of the different versions of us. There's the version of us that is going through extreme discomfort. There's the version of us that is already past that discomfort, that is at a more neutral state. And then there's also a version of us that is experiencing a lot of bliss and a lot of joy out of whatever the present moment may hold at that time. So if it's good, just enjoy it. Don't worry about anything else because that's the version of you who should be enjoying things. If it's bad, just bear it because that's the version of you that simply just has to bear it a bit longer. If you just continue to tell yourself, it will pass, you will eventually realize that there's nothing for you to do right now. All you have to do is get through this. Whatever storm, whatever mud you're walking through, just get through that. You don't have to be the version of yourself that is capable of making all the decisions. You don't even have to be the version of yourself that is capable of leaving your comfort zone, facing your fears. These are all the things that I often talk about, and they're really important. But when we're going through extreme discomfort, that's our only job at the moment, is just to bear that discomfort and move through it. And once we're kind of out of that, then we can return to that baseline that I mentioned before, and we can, go back to those goals we set for ourselves, go back to that daily routine. But, if you're like under the weather or something, that's not the time to say, I got to be way more optimistic. I got to be way more positive. It's like, yeah, those things are true. But if you're under the weather, just be under the weather for a couple days. And when that's over, then return. You don't need this deep inner conflict with your own mind where you're always trying to, you know, be this version of yourself. And I'm always saying through neuroplasticity or whatever else to become a version of yourself and to stick to that version of yourself, whoever it is you want to be. And that is completely true. And probably 95% of the time we have the, availability to act in that sort of way, no matter how difficult it may be emotionally. But when things are really difficult, like really difficult, and I mean, something that is obviously withholding you from acting in a certain way. There's an obvious storm that you need to sort of just wait on to pass. And I'm not talking about, lack of motivation or anxiety or fear or anything like that. These are more emotions that we deal with kind of on a daily basis or, every other day, weekly, whatever it may be. I'm talking about some of those one-off events, you know, some of those one-off events that cause a lot of discomfort, cause a lot of heartbreak, grief, sadness, whatever it may be. And you really just have to bear it. You just have to learn to bear it and understand that it will pass. Don't cling to it. Don't try to figure it out in that moment. Don't try to, be something greater than the experience because there's a chance that you're being pulled into this experience. Now, I'm not going to say for a reason, but that reason might reveal itself later. And it's not up to you to figure out the reason why you're experiencing this discomfort right now. Right now, you just have to go through it. You just have to experience it. You just have to be willing to sit with it while not adding on to the suffering that's already existing. Because those are two different things. There's continual suffering that is a result of us, not stepping outside of our own limitations. And then there is just inherent suffering, which is you stub your toe, you hurt your leg, you're under the weather, whatever it is. And when it's something like that that is out of our control, then it's just a game of not adding on, not adding fuel to the fire. It's probably going to hurt a little bit either way, but let it hurt in the way it was always going to hurt and not add a bunch of anxiety and fear surrounding it anyway. There's nothing that we could do to necessarily change any sort of inherent suffering that is going to, I guess, fall upon our path. There's going to be difficult experiences to go through, and we can't avoid them. And it can be kind of gloomy to think about, you know, pain and discomfort as something that is going to happen in the future, especially when you have many years, hopefully, left to live. But even in those experiences, they pass. They pass. It hurts. It sucks. It's not a good feeling, but it passes. And it's not the end of the world 99% of the time. And that's what your mind likes to do. All of our minds like to do is create a much bigger narrative rather than what's actually going on. And I'm not going to say this is the case for all situations. And this isn't something that we have to necessarily hold on to and embody in the moment of discomfort or pain or whatever it may be. But later on, a lot of the more difficult moments in our lives are, our favorite stories to tell with our friends or at social events or some of the funniest moments that, people and we crack jokes at. And that's not to say that the moments are inherently funny, but as a lot of time passes by, you distance yourself from that pain And so you no longer are associating it with the amount of emotional disruption that you would have when you were actually going through it. There's two big things I think that are important to remember right when you're in the fire, right when you're in the middle of it. Number one, it's not the end of the world. If something happens and it's temporary and it hurts, but eventually it ended, that is just a sequence of events that are placed in every single person's life. And I'm not talking about extreme cases of suffering, because when that's the case, you don't even have time to think about this stuff. You're just trying to survive. And of course, we're not talking about surviving some sort of atrocity or some sort of world event. We're talking about, things that happen in life, things that happen to everyday people every day, all the time. And that there's going to be no basis for trying to fear, falling ill. There's going to be no basis for trying to fear experiencing pain, because the inherent things that lie ahead of us, the inherent discomforts that lie ahead of us, those things we can't change. But what we can do is we can change the things that happen in the middle. So you can either live your life fearing that pain, that discomfort that everyone has to go through to one regard or another, or you live your life freely. And when the moment comes where discomfort arrives at your door, when pain arrives at your door, you deal with it in the moment. Yeah, it sucks. It's shitty. It doesn't feel good. And then it passes. And then you come back to baseline, and then you start living again. And then you have a sound mind. You feel more balanced, and you're able to make decisions, not completely influenced by the pain that you're experiencing. It's funny. It's like almost as if there's two options in front of you, two paths you've been debating on for a long time. Right at the moment when you're about to get, I don't know, surgery on your leg, you wouldn't make that decision right there and then, would you? It doesn't make any sense. You're not fully you when you're experiencing a significant amount of pain. So why would you ever make a choice in that mental state? It doesn't make any sense. It makes zero sense. You go through that surgery, you heal your leg, whatever it may be, and then eventually when it passes, then you make that decision. And now when the times are good, oh boy, when they're good, just enjoy it. Enjoy it. Don't hold on to it. Don't cling to it. It's when we were little, I'm sure many of you were like this. We didn't want the play date to end whenever we would be hanging out with our friends, right? You go over to one of your friends' house for a pool party or for a birthday party, and whenever it's time to go, you don't want to leave. You start crying and you want it to last forever. And looking at it from a higher perspective, we can now see how illogical that is. All good things come to an end. And it was a privilege to experience them in the first place. And holding on to them and trying to milk a really good thing is how we actually enter a really bad mindset. It's how addictions happen. That's how our life goes down the drain, because we're only hanging on to the positives. When in reality, life is more so about right in the middle. It's rare that times are very, very good, and it's rare that times are very, very bad. And honestly, for the most part, we experience more very, very good than very, very bad. And a lot of times when we have a negative mindset, we have the biases, whereas we say, oh no, I definitely experience very, very bad more often. And I would argue that's not true, because your version of bad is not something that you could live with every single day in a way, or the way that I'm kind of talking about it. Very, very bad is the lowest of the low, and very, very good is the highest of the high. And the highest of the high is emotionally and honestly by chance easier to encounter than the like very, very bad, because the very, very bad is very often not something that we can control, whereas the very, very good is something often that we can control, by setting up circumstances, by setting up events, setting up meetings, whatever it may be. I don't know. You're making plans and you're arranging things to happen, and when they do happen, you can experience the very, very good. And it's not very often where we are planning something and reorganizing things and something very, very bad happens, because something very, very bad is often due to the current of life. When someone is swept away into the ocean, who's to blame for that? You could say, if it's a kid, oh, the parents are to blame for not having an eye on them. No, but I'm saying, but who's to blame for the inherent action of the ocean pulling someone away? It's the ocean. It doesn't have a subjective point of view. And I think that's how we can kind of look at reality through that lens, is that when bad things happen, it's the current, it's the tide. And That isn't where the magic happens. The magic happens after the fact, where we're now back in this sort of middle ground of everyday life. We're back in the normalcy of it all, and we can actually learn from what happened. In the extremes isn't necessarily where the magic happens. When something is extremely bad, when something is extremely painful, the objective isn't to start manifesting. You know, you just bear it. You bear that pain until it feels better. And then when we're in the sort of day to day again, when we're in the, you know, going to work, going to school, living our daily life, back to our plans, back to our regularly scheduled activities, that's when we implement the things that we've been thinking about for a while. That's when we can learn from those events. It's not during the event that you really learn, it's afterward. It's not during the pain that you learn from it, it's after the pain, you know? And in that pain, I'll circle back. We have to realize again that it always passes. It always passes. And you'll cause yourself much more misery, much more suffering if you don't remind yourself of that often. It passes. It passes. It's going to suck. It's not going to feel good. It might hurt, but it passes. And we can take a deep breath and realize that even if it's bad, it will pass. There will soon come a moment. We shouldn't try to fast forward to that moment. Right now, if we're in the event of something disastrous or something really bad, painful, whatever it may be, we shouldn't try to fast forward to a moment where it's no longer existing. But we can recognize that sooner rather than later, we will be at a point where we're looking back at this pain rather than experiencing its intensity. When you go through some sort of turmoil, like when you get a wound on your arm or something, and you go through the process of healing that wound, you didn't learn right when you got struck. You didn't learn when you were experiencing the pain of the impact, the immediate impact. You learn months later, weeks later, whatever it may be. You learn from hindsight. So we can't always be the student. Sometimes we do need to be the quote unquote warrior that is going through the moment. And later on, we can be that sort of wise teacher that looks back upon it in reflection, in hindsight. But in the moment, let that be your affirmation. It will pass. Just bear it. Just experience it. Even if it's not pretty, even if it's ugly, even if it hurts, just experience it. It will pass. Don't add on to the misery. And more importantly, don't live your life in a way where you're constantly fearing that pain and discomfort. There's two things to that, two layers. Number one, accept that there will be discomfort. There will be uncomfortable times, and that's okay. It will pass. Number two, when involved in that discomfort, don't wish to be anywhere else. It's not possible. It doesn't matter. That's when we put our boots on, our brave face on, and we say, for the next however many minutes or whatever it is, I'm just going to go through this. I'm just going to go through this. Soon I will be out of it, but that version of me is not here right now. So I need to be here for myself right now. Thank you guys for listening. There's a little bit of a shorter episode, but I'm going to link my book down below. I go over ideas like this if you want to check it out. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe as always. If you're listening on Spotify, thank you as always. And that's it for me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.